In England, in the early 19th century, a woman's value was calculated the same way a horse's was by her bloodline, her conformation, and whether anyone with money wanted to buy her. The woman nobody wanted to buy was considered, at best, a kind of charitable afterthought tolerated at the edges of rooms she had not been invited to enter, useful for carrying things and remaining quiet and not requiring much in the way of maintenance. Her name, when it was spoken at all, was spoken last. Eleanor Vane's name was spoken last. She was the third daughter of a family that had spent its way down to nothing but the appearance of something, and her role at any gathering was to be present enough to be called upon and invisible enough not to embarrass anyone. When the Duke of Merrath came to call on a cold Tuesday in October, the butler read out 3 names from the card. Hers was not among them. She was standing at the sideboard, pouring tea no one had asked for, in a room that smelled of coal smoke, old roses, and the very specific anxiety of people pretending to be comfortable. She poured it correctly, which is to say, she poured it the way a woman pours tea when she has decided that doing it right is the only dignity available. Something happened in that drawing room. This is the story of what it cost her to let it. The drawing room of the Vane family's rented house in Portman Square smelled of coal smoke, forced roses, and debt, the specific debt that has been managed for so long it has acquired its own atmosphere, its own weight in the air. Eleanor had been in the room for 20 minutes before anyone acknowledged she was standing there, which was the usual arrangement, and she had used those 20 minutes to identify the 2 problems. No one else had noticed. The fire was drawing unevenly and would smoke within the hour, and the tea service set out by the housemaid was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of chipped or stained, but wrong in the sense that the pot had been filled too early and left on a tray with no warming plate beneath it, and anyone who poured from it now would be handing a lukewarm cup to a duke. Eleanor's mother, Lady Vane, born Horton, twice married and twice disappointed by the experience, was arranging Cecily by the window. Cecily was 23, fair, and had been trained since the age of 14 to stand in the light at an angle that minimized her slight jaw and maximized her considerable eyes. Augusta, the second daughter, sat at the pianoforte, touching the keys without pressing them, a performance of casualness that had taken several weeks to perfect. Eleanor watched both of them from the sideboard and thought, not unkindly, that they looked like a composition someone had arranged with great care and then left slightly overlit. She took the cold pot off the tray, carried it to the kitchen herself. The housemaid's face was a study in mortified apology and brought back a fresh one. She set it under the trivet properly. She replaced the cups with the second best set from the cabinet, because the first best set had a hairline crack in the teapot's lid that produced a high, thin whistle when the steam built, which it would, and the sound would break whatever impression the room was attempting to make. She did all of this in the time it took Lady Vane to arrange Cecily's shawl twice and pronounce it insufficient. No one thanked her. She had not expected anyone to. The Duke of Merrath was announced at 2:30 in the afternoon. Eleanor had a general picture of him from the previous season's gossip, which was that he was northern, solitary, not unkind but not particularly warm, and in possession of an estate that was running at a quiet loss for reasons no one in London had troubled to investigate. He was also, apparently, in need of a wife of good family and reasonable disposition, which was why Lady Vane had spent 3 weeks engineering this particular introduction. He was 31 years old and had never, as far as anyone could determine, been in love. He was taller than the gossip had suggested, and quieter. He came into the room the way a man comes into a room when he has already decided to leave it, not with hostility, but with a kind of low-level assessment, as if he were taking inventory. He bowed to Lady Vane. He acknowledged Cecily, then Augusta, with the correct degree of social warmth and not a fraction more. His eyes moved once across the room and came to rest, briefly, on Eleanor. She was not introduced. Lady Vane did not say her name. Eleanor continued to stand at the sideboard and did not look up. The conversation that followed was the standard kind remarks on the weather, on the season, on mutual acquaintances, on the general state of the country. Cecily managed it beautifully, which is to say, she asked questions that allowed the Duke to speak about himself without requiring him to say anything he had not already said at a dozen other drawing-room introductions. Augusta played 4 bars of something agreeable and then stopped, which was the correct quantity. Lady Vane deployed 3 different smiles for 3 different conversational purposes and hit her marks with the precision of someone who has been practicing for 20 years. The Duke listened to all of it with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. Then, at a gap in the conversation, one of those small silences that fall like plates between course, she said, "What is the current yield on improved pasture in Westmoreland, would you say? The enclosed variety, post-drainage." The silence that followed was of a different kind entirely. Cecily's expression did not waver, but something shifted behind it, the way a candle wavers when there is no detectable draught. Augusta's hands stilled over the keys. Lady Vane's third smile, the one she used for gentle redirection, began to assemble itself. Eleanor said, from the sideboard, 8 to 10 shillings per acre on the better ground. If the drainage work was done within the last 15 years and the slope is south-facing, less on the lower fields. If the clay runs deep, why has yours been assessed recently? The room went very quiet. Eleanor had not looked up from the tea service, which she was now arranging with the particular absorption of a woman who is not, in fact, absorbed in it at all. The Duke turned toward her. He took in her position at the sideboard. Her dress, which was clean and pressed but was not this season's cut, and the fact that she had answered him with a subordinate clause. "Not recently," he said. "Then the numbers your steward gave you are probably wrong," Eleanor said. She picked up the teapot and poured 2 cups with the unhurried efficiency of someone for whom this action required no thought. She carried the first to the Duke, because he was the guest. She did not extend it to him with a smile or a small bow or any of the additional social packaging that the moment might have suggested. She simply placed it within his reach, the saucer exactly steady, and then she went back to the sideboard. The Duke looked at the cup. He looked at her. He said nothing. Lady Vane's third smile had become her first smile, the one for genuine alarm. "Eleanor has always been fond of country matters," she said, which was the sentence she used for things she could not categorize quickly enough to suppress. "Has she?" the Duke said. It was not a question. He picked up the cup. He took 1 sip, which told Eleanor nothing except that the temperature was correct, and then he set it down with the careful deliberation of someone who has just had to revise something. He stayed for another 20 minutes and spoke to Cecily and Augusta with perfect courtesy and drank a 2nd cup of tea, which Eleanor poured without being asked. When he left, he bowed again to Lady Vane and said he had very much enjoyed the call and trusted they would see each other again at the Harrington Assembly on Thursday. Lady Vane said they would be delighted. The door closed. Cecily turned to Eleanor and said, pleasantly, "Must you?" It was not a question either. Eleanor returned the teapot to the tray. The room still smelled of coal smoke, and she could already see the fire beginning to draw wrong. Exactly as she had predicted. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make things worse, and she had learned very early that the distance between useful silence and complicity was a line she was allowed to stand on but not cross. 2 days later, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Lady Vane and written in a formal hand, and it requested a private meeting with Miss Eleanor Vane at her earliest convenience, at the home of the Duke of Merrath's solicitor. for the purpose of discussing a matter of mutual interest. Lady Vane read it 3 times. Then she went upstairs and did not come down for 2 hours. And when she did come down, her expression had acquired the particular set it had when she was calculating something she did not yet understand well enough to oppose. She handed the letter to Eleanor without comment. Eleanor read it once. She folded it carefully along its original crease. She placed it in the pocket of her apron, which was where she kept things that required thinking about, and she went to check on the kitchen fire, which had been troubling the cook for a week and which everyone else in the house had been too busy to address. The chip on the saucer rim was the color of old bone. She had noticed it while she was pouring and had considered moving the cup and then had decided not to, because the chip was on the outer rim of the saucer, not the cup, and the Duke would not see it from the angle at which she placed it. She had made the right call. She always made the right call, and she had learned to derive from this, not satisfaction exactly, but something quieter than knowledge that she had done the thing correctly, whether or not anyone had watched her do it. She did not know, yet, that he had watched her do it. She would learn this later, at a cost she could not then have named. 3 days passed between the letter's arrival and the meeting. In those 3 days, Lady Vane managed to ask Eleanor 4 separate times whether she had any idea what the Duke might want to discuss, using 4 different framings each, of which, Eleanor noted, was designed to make the question seem more casual than it was. Eleanor answered each inquiry with the same gentle vagueness, which was not dishonesty but was its close relative, and which she employed with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else. She knew exactly what the Duke wanted to discuss. She had known, with reasonable certainty, from the moment he asked about Westmoreland pasture yields. The meeting took place on a Thursday morning, in the offices of a solicitor named Galtnott, Thomas Galt, but his employer, the senior partner on a narrow street off Fleet Street that smelled of ink, brick dust, and whatever passes for discretion when it is worn thin by overuse. Eleanor arrived before the Duke. She sat in the chair on the near side of the solicitor's desk and arranged her gloves in her lap and did not look at the door. The Duke arrived 8 minutes after the appointed time, which was not discourtesy but was, she suspected, a test of some kind. He sat in the chair beside her rather than across the table, which moved the geometry of the conversation in a direction she had not anticipated. He waited until the solicitor had made his introductory remarks and withdrawn to the outer office, and then he said, without preamble, "My estate is losing ground, not the agricultural kind, the other kind." Eleanor looked at him for the first time at close range. His face was angular and weathered in the way of men who spend most of their time outdoors, and he had the eyes of a man who trusts numbers more than he trusts people, which she considered a reasonable position given the quality of most people she had encountered. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I know," she said. "I thought you might." He turned slightly in his chair. "You answered my question without hesitating. Most people hesitate when they don't know the answer. I answered it because I knew the answer." "Yes," he said, and there was something in the word that was not quite surprise and not quite its opposite. "There is a matter of tenants on the south-facing pastures. Long leases expiring. The paperwork is not in order. It rarely is. With drainage land," Eleanor said, "the enclosure statutes created problems the original surveyors did not account for, and most rural solicitors have not kept current with the subsequent amendments." He looked at her for a long, level moment. "Miss Vane," he said, "I would like to make you a practical proposal." She said, "I know that also." He almost smiled. It was very brief and did not reach the weathered parts of his face, but it was there. "Then I will be direct," he said. "I need a wife who understands the problem I have described. I do not need warmth or companionship or the performance of either. I need someone who can read a lease document without assistance and tell me when the numbers are wrong. Eleanor looked at her gloves, and in exchange, your youngest sister's dowry, he said. The current arrangement is I am told not, as your father originally intended. That was carefully phrased, Eleanor thought, for a man who had clearly already investigated the situation thoroughly enough to know that the phrase he wanted was fraudulent codicil and had chosen not to use it. She appreciated the care. It told her something about how he managed difficult facts. She looked up. There is one additional condition, she said. Name it. I will require access to the estate's land registry documents, all of them, including the drainage assignments for the south pastures. He studied her. She studied him back. That is, he said, slowly, a specific request. Yes, she said. The pause that followed was the kind in which a man who trusts numbers more than people arrives at the edge of something he cannot yet calculate. She did not fill it. She had learned that silence was a form of patience, and patience was almost always the correct instrument. Granted, he said at last. He extended his hand across the solicitor's desk, as one would to a business counterpart. Eleanor took it. They shook once, briefly. The way two people shake hands when they are agreeing to something both of them know is larger than it appears. They married on a Saturday morning at the end of October, in a church off the Strand that was known for its promptness and its discretion, before a congregation of 7, the solicitor, Thomas Galt, who had come down from Westmoreland on the Duke's instruction, Lady Vane with an expression of careful neutrality, Cecily with an expression of something more complicated, Augusta with genuine bewilderment, and a neighbour of the Duke's called Dorothea Kemp, who had apparently travelled from Kendal solely to observe and had opinions she was waiting to express at the appropriate moment. The ceremony was brief. The Duke said his responses with the directness of a man signing a contract, which Eleanor found appropriate. She said hers with the same directness. They did not look at each other during the exchange of rings, not because of tension but because neither of them were people who used eye contact as a performance. The vicar, who had conducted 342 marriages and could identify the unusual ones by their particular stillness, noted afterward to his housekeeper that he could not determine whether the couple were entirely indifferent to each other or entirely absorbed, and that the ambiguity had occupied him all through lunch. Lady Vane cried exactly one tear, which Eleanor suspected was less grief than relief. The loan agreements, as Eleanor understood it, were now technically the Duke's problem to manage, which meant Lady Vane had approximately 12 weeks before she would have to begin worrying about them again and intended to use every minute. Dorothea Kemp shook Eleanor's hand after the ceremony and said, "Well, you don't look like a fool," which is promising, and then stood back to observe the Duke with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting to observe him for some time. She was 62, a widow of 8 years, and owned more land outright than most of the men in the county, a fact she mentioned frequently enough to keep people honest. The journey north took 3 days, travelling in the Duke's coach with Thomas Galt as chaperone and companion, through weather that was doing its best to make Westmoreland sound like a bad idea. Eleanor spent the travel time reading through a set of documents Galt had brought with him at her request estate surveys. Lease schedules. The drainage assessments for the south pasture, with the focused attention of a woman who has waited a long time to see something and intends to see it properly. Galt watched her read with an expression Eleanor could only describe as relief that was trying to disguise itself as professional composure. He was a solid, careful man of about 45, who had been managing Merrath Park with not enough resources and too much responsibility for 7 years. And he had the look of a person who has been swimming just above water for so long that the existence of a floor has become theoretical. On the second evening of the journey, when the Duke had gone to see about the horses and left them with the fire in the inn's private parlour, Galt said, The drainage assessments in Section 7. There's a discrepancy. Eleanor turned to the relevant page. She had already found it. But she said, "Tell me what you see." He showed her. The lien assignments for 4 of the tenant farms in the south-facing fields had been transferred 3 years ago to a creditor in Lancaster whose name appeared in the ledger once and then never again. The transfer had been authorized under the late Duke's self, current Duke's father, who had died when the current Duke was 20, and the paperwork was technically correct, but the creditor's name was wrong. Not forged. Just wrong, the sort of wrong that happens when a solicitor copies from an old document without reading it carefully enough to notice that the name he is copying belongs to a man who had been dead for 12 years. At the time of the transfer, Eleanor said, "Yes, I see it." She closed the survey carefully. She returned it to the leather case where Galt kept his documents. She said, "Thank you for showing me." "I didn't," Galt said, after a pause. "Show you anything?" "No," Eleanor agreed. "You didn't." They arrived at Merrath Park on a Thursday afternoon, when the light was doing the North Country its particular justice cold, horizontal, and honest in the way of things that do not attempt to flatter. The house was large and stone, and had the specific quality of buildings that were not built for comfort, but have been lived in long enough that comfort has occurred anyway, reluctantly, in corners. It smelled of damp wool, smoke, and something underneath both, something mineral and old. The smell of a house that sits on the same ground it has always sat on and does not intend to move. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall for 3 seconds, and then asked Galt to show her where the kitchen garden was, and whether the kitchen garden's drainage had been separately assessed. Galt said it had not. She said she would look at it in the morning. The Duke showed her the house himself, which was not something she had expected. He did it with the economy of a man leading a tour of a facility rather than a home. "This is the library. This is the study. The accounts are kept in the second drawer on the left. The housekeeping ledger is here, and here, and here." He did not say anything about the rooms she would occupy, or about the arrangement of their lives together, beyond what the contract had already specified. She noticed that he walked the ground floor the same way in every room, always checking the southeast corner first. Then the window. Then the door back out. She did not comment on this. She filed it in the same place. She filed the tea service, and the drainage lien, and the discrepancy in Section 7, the part of her mind she kept running, even when the rest of her was doing something else. Over the following 2 weeks, Eleanor established herself in the house's routines with the same method she brought to everything she started with the kitchen, which was the room that revealed the most about a house's actual management as opposed to its theoretical management. The cook, a woman named Hesba, who had worked at Merrath for 19 years, showed her where the stores were and what they were short of and how the accounts had been kept, which was accurately, but without system. Eleanor introduced a system. She did it without calling it a system. She simply began doing things in a particular order and explaining the order to Hesba in terms that made sense to Hesba, which was the only kind of explanation worth giving. Galt observed this and said nothing, but he began leaving documents on the table in the room she had taken as her own, not the study, which was the Duke's, but the small room off it that had been used for nothing except storing outdated almanacs. She cleared the almanacs, had the window cleaned, and set up the table as a second desk. Within a week she had 3 ledgers running in parallel household accounts, estate income, and a third she kept locked. On a Tuesday evening, working late by candlelight with the fire down to coals and the house quiet, she opened the 3rd ledger to a page she had written in pencil, very small, and looked at a list of 8 names. Each name was a property. Each property was, on paper, held by a creditor in Lancaster who did not exist. She knew this because she had spent the previous 3 years writing careful letters to the parish registry and the county land office, and she knew what was in those files. She closed the ledger. She locked it. She put it back under the false bottom of the box she kept it in, which was not a sophisticated hiding place but was sufficient. She went to bed. She slept well, because she had always been able to sleep when the work was going correctly, and the work, so far, was going correctly. The Duke worked in his study every evening until 10:30 in the evening, at which point he would walk once around the ground floor of the house. She could hear his footsteps through the floor and then go to bed. On the fourth evening, passing the room she had taken as her workspace, he saw the light under the door and stopped. She heard him stop. After a moment, he moved on. In the morning, she found a copy of the previous year's tenant census on the corner of her table, which Galt confirmed the Duke had placed there himself. She did not mention it to the Duke. He did not mention it to her. But the following evening, she left the door open 6 inches, and the evening after that he stopped and looked in, and she said, without looking up from the census, "The tenancy at Merrath, oldest son. Is he managing alone since his father died?" The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then he came in and sat in the second chair, the one she had added to the room 2 days ago, which had until then served no purpose, she had acknowledged, aloud, and said, "Since the spring, he has a younger brother, but the brother took work in Kendal." Eleanor wrote something in the margin of the census. "Has anyone spoken to him about the lease renewal?" Galt was going to Galt hasn't, she said. "I would suggest going yourself." He did. He went the next morning. He returned in the late afternoon with mud on his boots and the expression of a man who has had a conversation he should have had earlier and knows it. Eleanor heard him in the entrance hall telling Galt something about drainage pipe and the eastern field, and she continued to write, and the fire burned down, and it was the most ordinary evening they had yet spent at Merrath Park, which is to say, they occupied the same space, worked on the same problem, and barely spoke, and it was not uncomfortable. The first seed of the twist occurred that same week. On a Wednesday, she asked Galt, with a casualness she had practiced, about the drainage lease assignments for the south-facing pasture. It's not the discrepancy she had already identified, but the question of who the current holder was and whether the letters had been traced. Galt's answer was careful and evasive in the way of a man who knows something is wrong and does not know how much of it he is responsible for. He said the original creditor had, to his knowledge, been based in Lancaster. He said the paperwork had been handled by the previous solicitor, who was no longer in the firm's employ. He said he would look into it further when he had the time. Eleanor said that was perfectly reasonable, and thanked him, and did not say anything else. She already knew the answer. She had known it for 3 years. What she was measuring, by asking, was how much of the answer the Duke's own staff had been allowed to see. The answer was not much. The crisis arrived in the first week of November, which Eleanor had predicted within a margin of 2 weeks, based on the dates in the lease schedules. 3 tenant farms on the south-facing pastures had leases expiring simultaneously, and the renewal documents that the current solicitor, a man named Prescott, who had been brought in from Lancaster 18 months ago, had prepared were wrong, not superficially wrong, wrong in a way that would, if signed, trigger an enclosure clause under the statute of 1801 that would effectively terminate the occupancy of the affected tenants without requiring the estate to compensate them. Eleanor found the error on a Monday morning, reading the draft renewal documents that Prescott had sent for the Duke's review. She read them twice. She set them on her table and looked at the wall for approximately 90 seconds. Then she took out her own copy of the amended enclosure statutes, which she had obtained from a law bookseller in London 2 months before her marriage, and which no one at Merrath had known she possessed. And she found the relevant amendment and wrote out, in a clean hand on a separate sheet of paper, the correct version of the 3 clauses that Prescott had drafted incorrectly, with the statutory reference beside each one. She carried the documents to the Duke's study. He was at his desk reviewing correspondence, which was where he spent his mornings when the weather made the fields inaccessible. He looked up when she entered, and she placed both documents in front of him, Prescott's draft on the left, her corrected version on the right, and she said, "The renewal documents for the South Pasture tenancies. Prescott's version would void the leases under the amended enclosure statute. My version corrects the error. I need your authorization to send the corrected draft to Prescott for revision." The Duke read both versions. He read them carefully, which she appreciated. He did not perform reading carefully. He actually read carefully, the way a man reads things when he believes they matter. Then he put both documents down and looked at her. His jaw was set. "You should have brought this to me before preparing an alternative draft," he said. "If I had come to you before preparing the alternative draft, we would have lost 2 days arranging for a legal consultation, and the deadline for the first renewal is Friday," Eleanor said. "The corrected version is right. You can have Prescott check it against the statute, which is on the shelf behind you, if you want to verify it before you decide." He did not look at the shelf. He looked at her for another long moment, with the particular quality of stillness that she had come to recognize as his version of a man trying to understand something he did not have a category for yet. Then he picked up the pen from his desk and signed the authorization on the bottom of her document. "Send it today," he said. "I already wrote the cover letter." Eleanor said, "I only need your signature on that as well." She placed the second sheet on top of the first. He signed it. She took both documents, went back to her room, folded them correctly, and gave them to the groom to carry to Kendall that afternoon. She heard him walking the ground floor that night for longer than usual. The following week, a man named Frederick Holt came to call. He was a neighboring landowner, comfortable, good-looking in the manner of men who have always been told they are good-looking and have made their peace with it, who had apparently been waiting for an opportunity to welcome the new Duchess of Merrath to the neighborhood, and had selected this particular Tuesday as the appropriate moment. He brought a brace of pheasants, which was the country equivalent of a formal card, and he came at an hour when the Duke was known to be out in the fields. Eleanor received him in the drawing room, because not receiving him would have required a social excuse she did not currently have. Dorothea Kemp, who had taken to calling at Merrath Park twice a week on no particular schedule and for no particular stated purpose, was already there and observed the visit with the focused pleasure of someone watching a chess game she has not been invited to play. Holt was pleasant. Holdwas, Eleanor thought, precisely as pleasant as a man needs to be when he is not sure yet whether he is welcome and has decided to defer the question by being pleasant. He talked about the county, about the weather, about the general state of the roads and the difficulty of the harvest that year. And he directed most of his remarks at Eleanor with the steady attention of a man who has noticed that she is not only the new Duchess of Merrath, but is also, in some way he cannot yet define, more interesting than the category would suggest. Dorothea watched him direct his remarks at Eleanor. Dorothea watched Eleanor receive them with perfect courtesy and absolutely no encouragement. Dorothea said, when the conversation lagged, "Miss, that is, Your Grace, I understand you've been sorting out the South Pasture business." And Eleanor said she had been helping with some of the paperwork. And Dorothea said, "Prescott is an incompetent, and everyone has known it since the summer." And Holt laughed with the ease of a man who laughs when other people say things he privately agrees with and hasn't said himself. The Duke returned while Holt was still there. He came through the side entrance, which meant he came in from the direction of the stables. And Eleanor heard him in the hall, and heard him stop when the housemaid said that Mr. Holt was visiting with the Duchess in the drawing room. There was a pause of about 4 seconds. Then he came in. He was perfectly civil. He greeted Holt with appropriate warmth and sat in the chair he generally used, the one farthest from the door. and closest to where Eleanor was sitting and participated in the conversation for 20 minutes. He did not touch Eleanor, say anything possessive, or give any visible signal of the thing Eleanor had observed passing across his face when he walked in and found Holt sitting 3 paces from her with his whole attention pointed at her. But he sat where he sat, and he stayed until Holt left. And afterward the room was the particular quality of quiet that rooms get when the source of attention has just walked out of them. Dorothea said, "Into this quiet." Well, that was informative. He brought pheasants, Eleanor said. Dorothea said. A week after that, Cecily and Lady Vane arrived for what Lady Vane described in her letter as a brief visit to see Eleanor settled, and what Eleanor recognized as an expedition to assess the terms of a loss. They came with 3 trunks and stayed in the East Wing, and the house, which had been finding its own quiet rhythm, readjusted itself around the arrival of people for whom quiet was a sign that something had gone wrong. Lady Vane inspected Merrath Park with the thoroughness of a woman conducting a valuation and concluded, silently, that it was better than she had been afraid of. Cecily was careful with Eleanor in the way she was always careful with Eleanor, not unkind, but with the specific watchfulness of someone who has always known that Eleanor was more than she looked, and has never decided how to feel about that. At dinner on the 3rd evening of the visit, Cecily said, pleasantly, across the table, "I hear you've been busy with the tenants." "Eleanor, it's admirable, really. Most women would just do their needlework." The table was quiet. Galt had been invited to dinner for the purpose of discussing the lease renewals, which had been successfully executed, and he looked at his plate. Dorothea, who had also been invited, did not look at her plate. Eleanor looked at Cecily. She said, "Assets take many forms." Cecily's smile did not waver. The Duke, at the head of the table, put his fork down with a precision that was not quite a sound, but was not quite not one, either. Lady Vane said, brightly, "Shall we have the pudding early?" The County Assembly in Kendal on the 22nd of November was the first public event at which Eleanor appeared as the Duchess of Merrath, which meant it was the first opportunity for everyone in the county to form an opinion about whether the Duke's choice made sense, and they took the opportunity seriously. Eleanor had dressed correctly, not extravagantly, because the situation did not require extravagance, and she had always found extravagance a form of argument she was not particularly interested in making, and she had danced once with the Duke, which was what the situation required, and once with Galt, which was what she wanted to do because Galt moved well and she needed to think. She was thinking about the drainage lien discrepancy. She was thinking about Prescott. She was thinking about the letter she had written 6 weeks ago to the parish registrar at Kendal, requesting a certified copy of a document she had reason to believe was relevant to a private legal matter, and about the response she was expecting to receive within the fortnight. Lady Vane found her standing near the punch table and said, pleasantly but with the kind of pleasantness that has teeth in it, "The Duke seems content. I did wonder whether a practical arrangement of this kind would suit him." "I think it does," Eleanor said. "Of course," Lady Vane said. "It is a little unconventional. I hope no one draws conclusions about the nature of the marriage that might be uncharitable." Eleanor looked at her. Lady Vane met her look with the smooth confidence of someone who has been making implications for so long that she no longer thinks of them as implications. She was about to say something. Eleanor never determined afterward what it would have been when Lady Vane continued, in a carrying voice that was precisely calibrated to be audible to the 3 couples standing within 10 feet of them. "I only ask because there has been some talk, you know, about the speed of it. People do wonder whether the Duke or his solicitor might have been misled about the family's connections, and a man of his position, to be fair, has every right to expect full disclosure of what he was entering into." The 3 couples within 10 feet had stopped pretending not to listen. The room was large, and most of it was occupied with its own conversations. But the small section around the punch table had developed the focused silence of people who recognize that something interesting is happening and intend to remember it. Eleanor did not look at Lady Vane. She looked at the punch table, at the ladle, at the arrangement of cups. Her hands were still. She said, quietly, "I see." She did not say anything else. She turned and walked back across the room to where the Duke was standing with Dorothea and 2 county magistrates, and she stood beside him and said nothing. And he looked at her face, and then he looked across the room toward the punch table, and then he looked back at her and did not ask, because he had understood not all of it, but enough. The assembly ended. They rode back to Merrath Park in the coach with Lady Vane and Cecily, in a silence that had the particular density of 4 people who each know different versions of the same story and have collectively decided to wait. Eleanor looked out the window at the dark north country and thought about the letter she had written to the parish registrar, and the certified copy she was expecting, and whether it would arrive before the fortnight was out or after. She thought it would arrive before. The morning after the assembly, the house smelled of cold ash, damp stone, and the specific silence of a disagreement that has been postponed rather than resolved. Eleanor came downstairs at 7:30 in the morning and found the Duke already in his study. The door was open. She had left it open for the past 6 weeks, whenever she worked in her own room, and he had begun to leave his door open in return, which was not a gesture she had commented on, and which she suspected he had not made consciously, the way certain things are done before they have been decided. He said, without preamble, "Galt pulled the land registry records this morning. I asked him to, after last week." He meant after he had visited the South Pasture tenants himself. Eleanor understood, and found the issue with the drainage lien assignments, and had not known what to do with it. There is a discrepancy. Eleanor came into the study and sat in the chair across from his desk. She said, "Yes, the lien on 8 of the south-facing properties, assigned to a Lancaster creditor. 3 years ago, the creditor's name is wrong. He had a folder open on his desk, and he turned it to face her. The documents were the same ones Galt had showed her, obliquely, in the inn, on their way north. Galt tells me the solicitor who processed the assignment is no longer with the firm." Eleanor looked at the documents. She said, "Prescott, you knew." "I suspected," she said. "I confirmed it." He studied her. "How long ago?" "I confirmed it approximately 10 days after we arrived at Merrath." She paused. "I had suspected it before that." The pause was long. Through the study window, the south pastures were visible in the pale winter light, the same fields the lien assignments were written to cover, the same fields she had been looking at for 6 weeks with the double vision of someone who sees both what is and what is also, on paper. "Not Miss Vane," he said, and then he stopped, because he had been about to use her old name, and she had a new one, and he had not yet found his way to using it with the ease that it required. He started again. "Eleanor, I need you to tell me what you know." She looked at him. She said, "All of it. All of it." Eleanor took a breath. She said, "The lien assignments for those 8 properties were transferred to a creditor who does not exist. The name in the ledger is a transcription error. It was made to look like one. The actual lien holder, as of 3 years ago, is not in Lancaster." She stopped. "Then where?" he said. She reached into the pocket of her day dress and placed a folded document on his desk. He opened it. It was a copy of a land registry filing, dated 3 years prior. The name of the lien holder, written in the formal hand of the county land office, was Eleanor Maris Hartley, which was her name before it was Vane, and before her mother's second marriage it had been her maternal uncle's name, who had left her his leaseholdings and the income from them, and, importantly, The contacts he had built over 20 years of doing exactly what Eleanor had done with the 8 Merrath properties. The Duke read the document. He set it down. He said nothing for 10 seconds. "You hold the lien," he said. "I hold the lien," she said. "On 8 of my tenant farms. On 8 of the properties the estate holds under drainage agreements on the south pastures. Yes." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been given a new piece of information and is trying very hard to determine whether the map he has been using for the last 3 months is simply incomplete or is actually wrong. "You purchased the lien assignments," he said, "before we met." "Before we met," she agreed. "The original creditor Nort, Prescott. The one before Prescott was in financial difficulty and sold the assignments to retire a separate debt. I purchased them through my uncle's old agent in Lancaster." "You knew whose land they were," he said. "I did know whose land they were," she said. "I had been following the Merrath estate surveys for 2 years at that point. The drainage land had been assessed poorly. The lien assignments had been handled badly, and the estate was in the kind of slow difficulty that very few people notice until it becomes a fast difficulty. I thought," she stopped. She looked at her hands. "I thought the most useful thing I could own, if I was going to remain without prospects indefinitely, was a position that gave me standing in a situation that someone would eventually have to resolve." "You were positioning yourself," he said. "I was protecting myself," she said. "I was not positioning myself in relation to you. I did not know you. I knew the land." He stood up from his desk. He walked to the window, and he stood there with his back to her for long enough that she could hear the fire settling behind the grate. She did not speak. When he turned around, his face had the quality of a man who has arrived at the end of an argument with himself and is still not certain which side won. He said, "In the drawing room, you answered my question about Westmoreland yields." "I knew the answer," she said. "Because you knew my land." "Because I knew your land," she confirmed. "And when I proposed the arrangement, the contract, you agreed." "I agreed." "Because you wanted the lien assignments regularized and the codicil in your sister's trust corrected." She looked at him steadily. "Because I thought you were the kind of man who would honor a debt rather than run from it," she said. "And because I had read enough of your estate correspondence, through the county records, to believe that the problem at Merrath was not a man who did not care about his tenants, but a man who had been given insufficient tools." She paused. "And because you asked about Westmoreland yields. Most men who come to look at families like mine do not ask about yields." The silence this time was of a different kind, not the silence of suppressed anger or recalibrating strategy, but something older and less manageable, with a silence of a person standing at the edge of a category they have always lived inside, and realizing the category may not be the size they thought. He said, "I chose you because you answered correctly." "Yes," she said. "And you answered correctly because you had been reading my land for 2 years." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "I thought I was doing you a kindness," he said. The words were quiet and not self-pitying, simply accurate, the way a man states an arithmetic error when he has found it. Eleanor looked at the document on his desk. She said, "I know you did." The morning light through the study window fell across the land registry filing, and across the desk, and across his hands where they rested on the back of his chair hands that she had watched sign lease renewals and authorization letters for 6 weeks, and which had, she noticed now, a scar on the left one, a long ridge of pale skin from the heel of the palm to the second knuckle, which she had seen before and had not asked about because there was a time for asking, and it was not any of the times that had yet arrived. He saw her looking at it. He said nothing about it. He moved away from the chair and went back to the window. "Prescott," he said. "The solicitor. He processed the original lien transfer. He prepared the defective lease renewals. Yes, he is connected to your stepmother's loan arrangements. Eleanor had not told him this. She said, "How did you know?" "I had him investigated after the lease document problem," he said. "His references traced back to a banking firm your stepmother has used since her first marriage." He turned from the window. She placed him, Eleanor agreed. "And the codicil in your father's will, the fraudulent one." "He drafted it," Eleanor said, "or revised it. I believe the original will was correct." "We need the original," he said. "I have been in correspondence with the Kendal Parish Registrar," she said. "There is a certified copy of the will as it was filed at the time of my father's death, before the codicil was added. I expect it to arrive within the fortnight." He stared at her. "You have been doing this since before I knew it needed doing." "Yes," she said. He sat back down at his desk. He put his hands flat on the surface of it, on either side of the land registry filing, and looked at the document as if it were a kind of arithmetic he had not been taught in school. Eleanor watched him and waited, because there was one more thing, and he had not yet found it, and she knew that finding it himself mattered more than being told. He said, slowly, "The lien assignments. You hold them, which means, technically, if I had defaulted on the drainage obligations, if the tenant situation had deteriorated further, you would have had legal standing to act against the estate." "Yes," she said, "but you didn't." "No," she said. "Even before we married, you held this for 3 years and did nothing with it. I was waiting for someone who would do something useful with it," she said, "rather than someone who would simply take the land." He was silent for a very long time. The fire settled again. Outside, one of the tenant farm's dogs barked twice, and then was quiet. Eleanor looked at the scar on his hand, and then looked away. He said, "The Lancaster solicitor, Prescott. He will fight this." "He will," she said. "He has already destroyed the document most easily used as evidence against him. The original codicil," she said, carefully. "The certified copy of the will as filed at the time of my father's death contains a notation from the parish clerk. The notation predates the codicil by 11 months. "Is that legally sufficient?" Eleanor said. "I believe so. I am not a solicitor, but I believe so." He looked at her. He said nothing for a moment. He said, "Prescott also has Lady Vane's support, and Lady Vane has the backing of the banking firm, which has every reason to prefer that the codicil stands. Because if it stands, your sister's dowry trust remains as constructed, which keeps a set of loan obligations in place that benefit the bank's arrangement with your stepmother." Eleanor said, "Yes, this will not be simple," he said. "No," she said, "but it is not complicated, either. It requires the right documents and the right authority to file them." She paused. "I have the documents." He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze. The fire was the only sound in the room, and then the dog barked again. Once, from somewhere close by, and then there was nothing. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "No, you don't. I thought I was selecting a useful woman," he said. "The way one selects a useful—" He stopped. "I know what you thought," she said. She stood up. "And I thought you were a man who would honor a debt." We were both correct. She picked up the land registry filing from his desk. She held it out to him. "This is yours. By right of the estate. I have held it in trust. I am returning it to you now." He took it. He held it in both hands and looked at it with the expression of a man receiving a thing he had not known was missing. She left the study. She closed the door behind her, not all the way, but not at the full open angle she usually maintained. 6 inches, then 3, and then she stood in the corridor for a moment with her hand still on the doorframe, and she thought about the scar on his hand and the fact that it was on the left one. which is the hand you use to brace yourself when you fall toward something. And she filed this thought in the same place she filed everything else, and went back to her own room, behind the closed door. She heard him sit very still for a long time, and then she heard him begin to write. He did not come out of the study until well past noon. When he did, he found Galt and told him to send for a new solicitor, not from Lancaster, but from York. Then he found Eleanor at her desk and said, "I need to know whether you are willing to appear at the land office in Kendal with me, formally, as the original holder of the lien assignments." She said, "Yes." "There is a second matter," he said. He stopped. "Tell me," she said. "Prescott has already moved. I received a letter this morning while you were in the kitchen." He laid the letter on her table. "He has advised Lady Vane that the certified copy from the parish registrar is likely to be challenged as irregular, on the grounds that a copy made at a third party's request is not equivalent to the original instrument." Eleanor read the letter. She said, "He is wrong about the law." "I know he is wrong about the law," he said, "but it will take time to demonstrate it. And in that time your sister's position isn't certain." Eleanor set the letter down. She looked at the ceiling, which was low and old, and had a watermark in the corner she had been meaning to ask Galt about. She said, "I know," he said. "There may be a faster way. If the estate," he stopped again. "Say what you mean," she said. "If the estate files an independent declaration of the trust's correct terms, based on the lien assignment documents that establish the estate's financial relationship to the original creditorto, youth in the codicil can be challenged on financial grounds rather than documentary ones. The filing does not require the parish copy to be valid. It requires only that the estate's records are consistent with the original will's intent." He paused. "But it would require the estate to formally acknowledge your prior position, publicly, as a creditor to Merrath, not a dependent of it." Eleanor said, "I know. It would require me to file documents that make clear that you came to this marriage with more leverage than I had," he said, "to the county land office, which is a public record." "I know," she said, for the third time. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "I am going to do it." She said nothing. "I thought you should know," he said, "before I filed." He left. She heard his boots on the stone floor of the corridor, and then the outer door, and then nothing. The third ledger was in its box under her table. The dog outside barked once, and then was quiet. In the distance, the south pastures were doing whatever south pastures do in November, which is to say they were being grey and cold and exactly what they were. She did not cry. She had not cried since she was 17, and had decided it was not the most useful instrument available, but she sat for a long time with her hands in her lap, and the fire making its quiet sounds, and the afternoon light going grey in the window. And she thought about a man who had walked into a drawing-room and asked about Westmoreland yields and drunk a cup of tea that was the correct temperature, and about the distance between useful and wanted, and whether the distance was as large as she had always assumed it was. She thought it might not be as large as she had assumed. This thought was dangerous, and she put it away carefully, in the same way she put everything away that she could not use yet. The new solicitor from York arrived on a Wednesday, and his name was Ambrose Fairbrother, and he had the pleasant quality of a man who has spent 30 years becoming very good at something difficult and no longer feels the need to announce it. He reviewed the documents at Merrath Park's dining table across the course of an afternoon, with Galt on one side of him and Eleanor on the other, and the Duke at the head of the table, asking precise questions that Fairbrother answered with the patience of a man who is used to precise questions and grateful for them. The strategy was clear. The estate would file an independent declaration at the Kendal Land Office, establishing the correct beneficiary of the South Pasture lien assignments as the property of the Merrath estate, transferred from Eleanor's prior holding by mutual agreement of the parties. with a formal acknowledgement of the nature of that prior holding attached as an exhibit. This would establish, publicly and in a permanent record, that Eleanor had been a creditor of the estate before she was its duchess, and that the estate had received the transfer of her holdings as part of the resolution of the same financial difficulties that Prescott had been engaged to manage and had instead made worse. Simultaneously, the estate's declaration would include a counterfiling, challenging the codicil in Eleanor's father's will on financial grounds, as Callum had proposed, not by attacking the document directly, but by demonstrating that the trust structure the codicil created was inconsistent with the financial relationship between the Vane family and the Merrath estate as now correctly recorded. It was, Fairbrother acknowledged, an elegant approach. He said so with the particular admiration of a solicitor who has encountered something he would not have thought of himself and wishes he had. The filing was submitted on a Thursday morning. Eleanor was there, as she had agreed. She stood at the land office counter in Kendal and produced her documents and stated her prior position clearly, in a register that was audible to the clerk and to the two other parties conducting business at the adjacent windows. And she did it without hesitation and without apology, because she had never been apologetic about being correct and did not intend to start now. By Thursday afternoon, Prescott had filed an objection. He was faster than they had expected. His objection was detailed and technically sophisticated, which meant he had prepared for this scenario before they filed, which meant, as Fairbrother noted with a certain professional displeasure, that someone had told him they were coming. Lady Vane, Eleanor said, because she knew who had told him and did not see the point of being indirect about it. The objection challenges the authenticity of your uncle's original lien purchase, Fairbrother said. He had the documents spread across the dining table again. He is claiming the transfer was made under duress, and that the prior creditor, your uncle's agent, had no standing to sell the assignments without the estate's consent. That is not what the statute says, Eleanor said. It is not what the statute says, Fairbrother agreed, but it will take the land office 3 weeks minimum to review the challenge. And in those 3 weeks, my sister's trust remains in Prescott's version, Eleanor said, and Lady Vane's loan arrangements remain intact, Galt said. From the far end of the table, the Duke stood up. He walked to the window, the same window he always walked to when he needed to think, and stood there with his hands in his pockets and his back to the room. Eleanor looked at his back and said nothing. 3 weeks, he said, to the window. At minimum, Fairbrother said, and the parish registrar's copy. Still in transit, Eleanor said. It was dispatched from Kendal a fortnight ago, but there was a delay with the postal route, the flooding on the northern road. I expect it by the end of the week. If it arrives before the land office review concludes, Callum said, still to the window. Does it change the calculation? Fairbrother said. It would. A certified copy from the parish registrar predating the codicil, combined with the estate's independent declaration, would give us 2 independent legal bases for the challenge. That makes Prescott's objection considerably harder to sustain. But if it doesn't arrive in time, Eleanor said, then we wait 3 weeks, Fairbrother said, and your sister waits with us. The room was quiet. The window showed the north country in early December, bare hedgerows, a low sky, the south pastures running grey and brown toward the hills. Eleanor looked at the documents on the table and thought about her youngest sister, Augusta, who was 20 and had her father's eyes and had been waiting, in the way that youngest sisters in difficult families wait, for something to be resolved that she did not fully understand and had never been told about directly. She had not been told because Eleanor had not wanted to tell her until there was something concrete to report. There was not yet something concrete to report. Callum turned from the window. He said, to Fairbrother, I want to see the estate trust documents. All of them. Tonight. Fairbrother said he would have them prepared. The trust documents were laid out on the dining table by 8 in the evening, and Callum went through them with Fairbrother for 2 hours, while Eleanor sat at the far end of the table with her own papers, her own work, and the particular quality of not listening that is actually listening, with the full attention of a woman who has learned to gather information in rooms where she is not supposed to be paying attention. At 9:30 in the evening, Callum said, "Pull the investment reserve schedule." Galt, who had stayed at Callum's request, pulled it from the stack at his elbow. Callum read it without speaking. Eleanor, at the far end of the table, put her pen down. The investment reserve was money Callum had been setting aside since he inherited the estate at the age of 20, not the estate's operating funds, but his own personal income, the discretionary portion that was his to do with as he chose, 11 years of it. Eleanor had seen the schedule in passing while reviewing the broader estate accounts, and she had noted the amount and then looked away from it. The way you look away from something that is not yours to see, even when it is sitting in plain sight. He had built it as penance. She had understood this for weeks, without having been told. He had ordered a drainage ditch dug on the estate when he was 19 years old, and his brother had fallen into it in the dark and been carried home with his lungs full of mud and river water. And his brother had lived, but had lived differently afterward, more slowly, more carefully. In a room on the first floor, because he could no longer manage Stairsand, Callum had managed the estate ever since, with the focused attention of a man who is working off a debt that cannot be paid in money, and has decided to pay it in time instead. He said, to Fairbrother, "I want to restructure the trust instrument." Fairbrother looked at him. "The investment reserve goes into the estate trust as the primary operating capital, not a supplement. The primary." He was not looking at the documents. He was looking at the table. "And the trust instrument is amended to name a co-trustee with equal standing." Galt was very still. Eleanor was looking at the window. She was not looking at the table or the documents or the schedule. "A co-trustee," Fairbrother said, carefully. "With equal standing. Would you name—" "Yes," Callum said. He picked up the pen from the table. He held it for a moment, and she could see from the angle she was not supposed to be watching from his hand pause over the page. His left hand, flat on the table beside the document, the scar at his palm, pale in the candlelight. He wrote her name. He signed the first page. He turned to the second and signed it. On the third page, his hand stopped for perhaps 2 seconds, and then it moved, and he signed it and turned to the fourth. He signed all 8 pages. He pushed the amended instrument across the table to Fairbrother without saying anything else, and he put the pen down. And he sat back in his chair with the particular quality of stillness that follows a decision that cannot be taken back. Galt said, quietly, "Well done, Your Grace." Callum said nothing. He pushed his chair back and stood up and went out of the room. Not to the window this time, but out entirely, and Eleanor heard his boots in the corridor, and then the outer door again. Going toward the stables, which was where he went when he needed to be somewhere that did not require him to say anything. Eleanor looked at the amended trust instrument on the table. She looked at her name written in Callum's hand across the co-trustee line, with the signatures beneath it. She picked up her pen again. She returned to her own papers. She wrote 3 lines, and then stopped and looked out the window at the dark. And then she wrote the letter she had been composing in her head for 4 weeks, to her youngest sister, Augusta, who had her father's eyes, and had been waiting without knowing what she was waiting for. The certified copy from the parish registrar arrived on a Friday morning, 3 days before the land office's review was scheduled to conclude. The letter carrier arrived at 8:30 in the morning, and Eleanor was at the door before the housemaid, and she took the packet from his hands herself and brought it inside without opening it until she was at her desk. The copy was 17 pages, closely written in the clerk's formal hand, and it was exactly what she had needed it to be, The original will as filed at the time of her father's death, 14 months before the codicil was added, with the clerk's registry notation on the first page and the registrar's seal on the last. There was no codicil. There was a clear statement of the trust terms as her father had intended them, including Augusta's dowry schedule in its original form. She brought the document to Callum. He read it. He said, "Today." They went to Kendal that afternoon. The Kendal solicitor's office that Fairbrother had arranged as the meeting location was a narrow room on a good street, smelling of ink, old paper, and the very specific wariness of a room that has hosted difficult conversations and expects to host more. Fairbrother was there, Callum was there, and Galt, and Eleanor. On the other side of the table, Prescott, with his case documents, and Lady Vane with her careful expression, and Cecily, who had come because Lady Vane had insisted on it, and who sat slightly apart from both of them with the expression of someone who has decided the journey is not worth the destination and has arrived anyway. Prescott opened with the objection. He was thorough and composed, and made his challenge to the lien assignment transfer with the fluency of a man who had rehearsed it. He was halfway through the second point when Eleanor said, "May I?" Fairbrother, beside her, did not look up from his notes, but something in his posture shifted slightly toward satisfaction. Eleanor placed the parish registrar's copy in the center of the table. She said, "This is a certified copy of my father's will as registered at the time of his death, bearing the parish registrar's seal and the date of registration. The date of registration is 14 months before the codicil was added to the estate's version of the document." She placed a second document beside it. "This is a certified copy of the County Land Office's registration of the lien assignments for the south-facing pastures of the Merrath estate, showing the original transfer date and the holder's name at the time of filing." She placed a third document. "This is the amended Merrath Estate Trust Instrument, signed and sealed, naming the co-trustee and establishing the correct provenance of the investment capital used to restructure the trust." The three documents, taken together, he established the following. She looked up and spoke to Prescott directly, because he was the one who had done the most work and deserved the most direct answer. "The codicil to my father's will cannot be valid, because the financial relationship between the estate and its creditors that it purports to reflect did not exist in the form the codicil describes at the time it was added. The lien assignments establish that the creditor relationship flowed in the opposite direction from me to the estate, not from the estate to the family. The codicil, therefore, describes a fiction," Prescott said. "The certified copies do not constitute the original instruments." "The objection stands," Callum said. "The County Land Office has the original of the lien assignment transfer on file. It was filed there. It is not a copy. The registrar's seal on the parish document is legally equivalent to the original under the Act of 1812. He set a fourth document on the table. "This is the statute, page 17. Third clause," Fairbrother said, dryly. "We took the liberty of bringing it." Prescott looked at the statute. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at Lady Vane. Lady Vane said, "This is not there are other." She stopped. She looked at the documents on the table. She looked at Eleanor. She said, with a flatness that was almost admirable in its directness, "You planned this." Eleanor said, "I prepared for it. There is a difference." Lady Vane said, "You married him for this." Eleanor said, "I married him because he asked about Westmoreland yields." Lady Vane stared at her. It was, Eleanor thought, the most honest exchange they had ever had. Cecily, from her chair slightly apart from everyone else, said, "I told you she had nothing to lose." She did not say it to Eleanor. She said it to Lady Vane. And she said it with the flatness of someone delivering a thing she had believed for a long time and had been waiting to say aloud. She was not exactly on Eleanor's side, but she was. in this moment, at least in the same room as the truth. Lady Vane looked at her eldest daughter. She said nothing. Prescott attempted 2 more objections. Fairbrother dismissed the first on statutory grounds, and Callum dismissed the second with a patience that was also, Eleanor recognized, something harder, not cruelty, but the specific firmness of a man who has decided that patience has a limit and has located the limit. The final objection did not arrive. There was a silence, and then Prescott gathered his documents with the economy of a man who has decided that the remaining moves cost more than they return. And Lady Vane sat very still, with her hands in her lap, and the room smelled of ink and old paper and the particular exhaustion of a long, careful plan that has arrived at its final accounting. The fraudulent codicil was voided. The trust terms were restored to Eleanor's father's original intent. The loan arrangements that had depended on the codicil's terms were already void. As Fairbrother had filed the corrections to the county registry the previous day, Lady Vane was not destroyed. She was contained financially, legally, permanently, by documents and authority, and a certified copy from a parish registrar who had never met Eleanor and had simply done his job correctly when asked. On the way out of the building, Cecily stopped beside Eleanor for a moment. She said, quietly, "You could have told me about the codicil." Eleanor looked at her. She said, "I wasn't sure. 3 years ago, which side you'd be on." Cecily considered this for a moment. She said, "I'm not sure I was either." Then she walked out, following Lady Vane, and Eleanor stood on the step for a moment in the cold December air that smelled of coal fires and the river and something sharp and clean coming off the hills. Callum came to stand beside her. He said, "Well," she said, "well." They walked to the coach. The small library at Merrath Park had been Eleanor's room for 6 weeks, not because anyone had designated it as hers, but because she had gone into it on the 3rd day and had not left anything in it, but had returned the following morning, and the morning after that, and eventually it was hers the way things become yours in a house no, by declaration but by repeated presence. It smelled of old paper, leather, dry wood, and something faintly sweet that she had never identified and had decided to leave unidentified because it was pleasant. She was there on the evening of the day after Kendal, with the fire at a reasonable height and the lamps lit, and a letter to Augusta that she had now written and sealed and given to the groom for posting. The letter said, among other things, that the trust was corrected and the dowry secure, and that Augusta might consider the problem resolved, and that Eleanor was sorry it had taken as long as it had, and that she hoped Augusta's opinion of the North Country might improve with time, because it was, Eleanor had found, a place that rewarded patience. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, the particular pattern of them, which she had learned in 6 weeks, the way you learn the sounds of a house you intend to stay in. He stopped outside the library door, which she had left open in the usual way, and he came in. He set something on the table beside her. She looked at it. It was the teacup, the cream-coloured one from the Portman Square drawing room, the one from the second best set, the one with the chip on the saucer rim, but the chip was no longer a chip. It had been filled with something that caught the lamplight in a specific way, gold and slightly uneven, the texture of a repair that had been made by hand rather than machine, careful and visible, and clearly not trying to pretend the damage had not occurred. She looked at it for a long time. He said, "I had a craftsman come up from Kendal. He knew the method." He stopped. I could not think of a different way to say it. She looked up at him. She said, "Say what?" He stood across the table from her. He had his hands in his pockets, which was what he did when he was working out how to say something in a language he had not been taught. He said, "I was wrong about what I was doing. In that drawing room, I thought I was selecting someone useful." He stopped again. He tried again. I thought I was recognizing a capability. You were, she said. I was recognizing someone who had already decided to trust me, he said, before I had given her any evidence that I deserved it. He looked at the table. That is not the same thing. She said nothing. He said, I do not know how to account for that. Properly. I know how to account for the lien assignments and the lease renewals and the trust instrument. I know how to account for the Kendall filing. He paused. I do not know how to account for someone who purchased a creditor position on my estate 3 years before she met me, and who used that position to protect my tenants rather than exploit them, and who agreed to a contract that required her to make herself useful in my house and did not once, in 6 weeks, make me feel the weight of what I had asked her to do. Eleanor looked at the repaired teacup. The gold in the chip caught the lamplight. She thought about Portman Square, about the cold pot and the wrong cups, and the smell of coal smoke and forced roses and debt, and about setting the cup within his reach with exactly the steadiness of a woman who has decided that doing it right is the only dignity available, and about not knowing, then, that he was watching. She said, I don't want it accounted for. He looked at her. She said, I want it carried. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I do not know how. I know, she said. That does not help. No, she agreed, but you could sit down. He looked at the second chair, the one she had added to the room that had served no stated purpose. He sat down in it. He did not say anything. She said, the scar on your left hand. He looked at his hand. He said, a drainage ditch. 1809. He stopped. He said, my brother. She said, I know. I read the county survey notes from that year. The flooding on the eastern field. She looked at him directly. Your brother is living. He writes to you on Tuesdays. He looked at her. She had not meant to say that she had noticed, but she had noticed for 6 weeks. And the fact of it had the weight of something she had been carrying without knowing she was carrying it. He said, he is well. She said, good. He said, after a pause, he would like to meet you. She said, I would like that. He looked at the teacup. He said, the craftsman called it kintsugi. It is a Japanese method. The breakage is visible, deliberately. The repair does not pretend the break did not happen. I know, she said. He said, I thought it was the correct method. It is, she said. He said, Eleanor. It was the first time he had said her name without the hesitation that had accompanied it for 6 weeks not easily. Exactly, but without the pause of a man who is not yet sure he is allowed. He said, I do not know how to say this without it sounding like a contract. She said, then say it like a contract. He said, I would like, going forward, for the terms of the original agreement to be amended. He looked at the fire. The original terms required nothing beyond function. I would like to propose additional terms. He stopped. She said, name them. He said, that you stay. He was looking at the fire. Not because the estate needs you, because I. He stopped again. He said, with the specific difficulty of a man who has very few words for the things that matter most. Because I would like you to. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 3 years of careful letters to county registrars and parish clerks, and about purchasing the lien assignments on a stranger's estate without knowing yet that he would ask about Westmoreland yields, and about the distance between protecting yourself and hoping for something, and whether the distance was a fence you crossed or a line you were always already on the other side of. She said, those are not very good additional terms. He said, I know. She said, you should also specify that you will go yourself to see the Aldermere tenant when the eastern field drainage needs assessing in the spring, rather than sending Galt. He said, agreed. She said, and that the second chair in this room is permanently installed. He said, "It already is." She looked at the repaired teacup. She looked at him. She said, "Then I accept the amended terms." He exhaled. It was not dramatic, just a breath that had been held at a low level for some time. Releasing. He did not move toward her or say anything else, because he was not a man who moved toward things or said things before he had worked out the sequence. And she understood this about him, the same way she understood the yield on south-facing pasture by, paying close attention for a long time. She poured the tea from the pot on the side table, which was at the correct temperature because she had set it there 20 minutes ago. She handed him a cup, not the repaired one, the one beside it, plain and ordinary. He took it with his left hand, the scarred one, and he held it without drinking for a moment, and she thought he might say something else. He did not say anything else. He sat in the second chair, and she sat in her own chair, and the fire burned, and the lamps burned, and outside the North Country was doing what it always did in December, which was being cold and honest, and exactly what it was. Coda. A morning in January. The fire was built early, because Galt had started having the fires built early, when he understood that the library was in use before most of the house was awake. 2 cups on the table, both at the correct temperature. A ledger open beside Eleanor's hand. A letter in Callum's. His boots left mud on the flagstone near the door, which meant he had already been to the south pastures and back. And the mud on the south pasture in January is the color of iron and old leaves. Her handwriting was on the lease renewal beside his. His signature was beside hers, outside the window. The snow that had threatened all week had not materialized, and the hedgerows were bare and honest in the low grey light, and the kitchen garden's drainage, which she had assessed herself in November, and had arranged to have corrected before the ground, Frozawas holding. She poured a second cup of tea for him without looking up. He took it without looking up. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said that was not already, in some form or another, in the room with them. Not fixed, not finished, not the kind of story that ends with everything resolved into certainty, but the kind that settles, slowly, into something that holds the way good drainage holds, the way a well-built lease holds, the way a repaired cup holds the tea you put into it, not despite the gold in the break, but because of it. A duke walked into a drawing room where 3 women had been arranged for his consideration, and he chose the one pouring tea, and everyone assumed this was a love story. It was not. At first, it was a contract between 2 people who understood that the most honest relationship is one in which both parties know exactly what they are getting. But somewhere between the lease renewals and the parish registrar's certified copy, and a craftsman from Kendal who knew a Japanese method for repairing broken things, it became something elsenot instead of the contract. But underneath it, the way good ground is always underneath the deed. If you stayed until the end, you already know what kind of story you love. Leave a like if it landed, and share it with someone who needs a heroine whose weapons are a land registry and a correctly brewed cup of tea. Subscribe and ring the bell so the next story finds you. And here is the question worth arguing about in the comments when Eleanor purchased those lien assignments 3 years before she ever met the Duke. Was she acting in hope some part of her, already reaching toward a future she could not know more? Was she purely protecting herself, with no thought of him at all? I think the answer is different for every person who watches this, and that is exactly why I want to know yours. See you in the next story. Hết kịch bản. Tổng số từ 9. Joe by Joshua.